Okay, now we are looking at part 2, the other fundamental basic camera operation that we are learning about this week is called your shutter speed. The shutter controls the amount of light by the length of time the shutter is open. The shutter is located in the body of your camera, and it's actually the sound that you hear as you're taking the photograph. So you click the exposure button, you press down halfway, you might hear a sound that sounds similar to zzz, zzz, zzz. That's actually your lens focusing. And then when you click the shutter button, the sound that it makes is literally the sound of the shutter opening and closing inside the camera. And sometimes this can be very loud or very quiet depending on the camera you have. And if you have a mirrorless camera, then it is quieter. One part of the reason why the shutter, when it opens and closes during an exposure, that it's so loud is because there's an actual mirror inside your lens that has to flip up. Inside the camera body that has to flip up, and that is kind of loud. So the shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of seconds. Each shutter setting is half or double the time of the next one and is described in terms of fractions. But don't panic, you'll get this, okay? Common shutter speeds, just like we have common f-stops, we also have common shutter speeds. And they are 1 second, half a second, a quarter of a second, eighth, 1/15th, 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/25, 1/250, 1/500, and 1/1000 of a second. Those are the basic common shutter speeds. Note that each one is half the duration of the previous setting. And so what that means is that 1/2 is actually half of 1 second. So literally going from, let's say, left towards the right, if we were to write these all in a row, we are cutting our time in half, almost quite literally. So half is half of 1 second, a quarter is half of a half, an eighth is half of a quarter. And then we, instead of going to a 16th, we get to a 15th of a second, and 1/30th of a second is half of 1/15th. Now, as the bottom number is getting larger, it's actually a much smaller moment of time. Like, taking your pizza and cutting it in all of these different sections. So 500 pieces of pizza versus 2 pieces of pizza. It's a 1/500th is much more of a tinier fraction of time than 1/2. And then going in the other direction, let's say from 1/1000th to 500th of a second, you are doubling your time. You're no longer cutting in half. Cutting in half is from 1/500th to 1,000. Doubling your time is going from 1/1000th of a second to 1/500th of a second. Doubling your time from 1/500th to 1/250th of a second, and so on, going in this direction. A fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second or 1,000th of a second, can stop the action. And a slow shutter speed, like 1/30th, 1/15th, will blur the action. Notice that when the shutter speed gets slower, a lower fraction number, the action in the image starts to blur. So here's an example of that here, and here's the exposure. This was photographed at f16 at 1/60th of a second at ISO 400. So at f16, the background is fairly sharp. Everything from the foreground to the background is pretty sharp. But because the shutter speed is slow at 1/60, those two figures running from left to right are very blurred. So the bodies become sort of blurred, indistinct, and distorted. Notice that when the shutter speed is set to a higher fraction number, a faster shutter speed, the action becomes sharper and stopped. So yes, there are definitely more dynamic stop action photographs, but this is a very basic one to show you that an action photograph really only is visually an action photograph if you can see that action being stopped sort of mid-action. So in this case, they're jogging in front of the lens going left to right, and my exposure at f8 at 1/400th of a second, quite a bit faster shutter speed than 1/60 at ISO 400, captures them in mid-air, so they're floating off the ground. So when we take action shots and we want to stop that action, Showing the action actually stopped is really important. So if they were just sort of walking, but both feet were on the ground, it wouldn't look like an action photograph. They could literally just have been standing there still. But this, capturing them in midair, shows that action. This is an example of panning. Panning is when you move your camera along with the motion of the action. And we will have a whole week dedicated to photographing action and blur action and panning subjects. So you will get plenty of experience with this. What you do for this is focus on the people moving or the object or subject in motion. And as they move through the frame, whether it's left to right or up or down or diagonally, you will capture them fairly sharp, but the background will have a streaking blur to it. And so here we are at f16, 1/160th of a second at ISO 400. It's that slow shutter speed that is allowing the background to have a streaking sort of left to right blur. And you can see that in the Coca-Cola sign, the sort of double letters. And here where it says beer, you can see the doubling of those letters. While the subject that I'm actually have my focus dot on is fairly sharp. In panning, you would never expect the subject that you're focusing on to be absolutely perfectly sharp, but you do want to try to get the face of the person or the body or the front. If you're photographing a car, you would focus on the front of the car or the driver of the car. If it was a bicycle, again, the face of the person or the front of the bicycle, trying to get that as sharp as you can.